So, we have a summary of the major points that are in this actually really amazing chapter. It was sort of amazing to be given these two chapters to reflect on because they're both so very deep. There's so much in both of them. This is another one I highly recommend really spending some time with at the points that he's trying to get across here about what it means to live in a world in which all sentient and non-sentient beings live in one integral reality where everything is connected to everything else. So I'm going to share some reflections on that. Some of them will be hard because we need to look at some of the hard stuff. But I think also help point when we see some of the hard realities of ecology, we see also some of the ways out because we begin to see contrast between what has been, what we're doing, what humans are doing now, and what possibilities are for healing. So this is just a very basic definition of ecology. Ecology studies the relationship between living organisms and the environment in which they develop. We're one of those living organisms. So sometimes it's helpful to study the relationship between this living organism and the environment in which we develop and on which we are having an enormously large impact right now. The Pope, I should sometime count how many times he says in this encyclical that everything is interconnected. He says this so often and in so many different ways, but I just want to lift it out again because sometimes I think we hear this so much, we forget the profundity of what this means, that everything is interconnected. So we're sitting in this room right now. I have this wooden podium. You're sitting in those chairs. We're breathing in, we're breathing out. Lights on, all this technology working, everything is interconnected. Everything we're doing comes from impacts before this moment, and from this moment impacts go out. And what we're doing is, we have our own interrelated reality right here. We're in an ecology right here of our relationships with each other. We're sharing the breath, right? We share the food. You know, we're listening to one another, to our bodies, to the way in which we talk to each other, our body language. All of this is part of what it means to live in an integral environment. And we are as healthy as that environment is healthy, right? We are porous. If we take in toxic stuff, we will be affected by that toxic stuff. If we do toxic things, the things we do those to will also be toxically contaminated. So this is just the reality of our lives. There's no way to escape that. There's no pure moment when I can pull myself out of that reality and be all by myself having no impact. And I think that as obvious as that is, I think sometimes it's one of the hardest points to make in a culture that's based on this false notion of individualism. That an individual can ever live separately from the whole. There is no way to do that, and even the attempt to do that has enormous impacts on the whole. Okay, so that's part of the challenge of a chapter like this, where we're looking at integral ecology. Everything is interconnected. Everything is interconnected. We can focus a lot on the beauty. Those last two photographs were mine. They were taken in the mountains of Alberta, Jasper National Park. At the origins of a river, I'm going to talk about in a little while, in terms of what it means that environment that everything is interconnected. But this too is part of our world, right? Everything is interconnected. Go out on the interstate, right? You can start on the interstate and you can spend the rest of your life driving around the interstate because it's all interconnected now. Everything is interconnected, right? The stuff that we put into the atmosphere, the pollution, it goes up into the atmosphere and the earth carries it around on the jet stream and the way the winds flow. So here's our East Coast pollution wafting over the Atlantic Ocean. Some of you have heard of this, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. There's a vortex in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, far away from any land. There's this vortex. And this vortex gathers up garbage that's dumped from ships, from islands, from beaches on the West Coast and on Hawaii. And the ocean waves, the currents, gather it into this vortex and has created this patch of garbage that's so thick you can walk on it, and it's about as big as the state of Texas. That's plastic garbage. If you look closely, you'll find a lot of plastic bottles in there, by the way. There are other places like this where very dramatic things are going on off the beaches of the shores of Alaska. There's the beach in Hawaii that happens to be a place where a lot of the ocean currents gravitate and gather all this garbage that we're putting into the oceans. Everything is interconnected. The Alberta tar sands industrial region, and that's the story I want to share a little bit. It's just as kind of a point of reflection to give us a really clear picture of what we're dealing with here and what the Pope is trying to talk about. This was 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, actually September of 2013, so it's going on 3 years. But I spent 2 weeks in Alberta with 5 other lovely people, all Canadians, and me. And it was an idea that I had. I really wanted to be an eyewitness to what the tar sands industrial region looked like, what was really going on up there. And to have some time to visit these First Nation communities that are just downwind and downriver from the tar sands, whose lives are just being completely upended by this development. What you're looking at was boreal forest 20 years ago. But the idea that this wonderful Sister of Charity had, who was from Alberta, was that rather than just drop in on the tar sands, why don't we start at the origins of the Athabasca River, which runs to Fort McMurray in the tar sands region. Fort McMurray is like the economic center of the tar sands region. And spend some time, some days, just traveling the route of that river. So that's what we decided to do. It took us a couple of weeks to make this round trip. We packed up a van and went off on our way. And the first stop was at this glacier in Jasper National Park, which is the origins of the Athabasca River. Beautiful, beautiful place. I should have included a couple of photographs to ease your eyes from the horrors of this area, but it's just, you're standing in front of this glacier, here's the water melting, and it starts down this canyon, and that's the origins of this magnificent river in Alberta, one of the most beautiful in North America. And then we spent the next days kind of traveling along it. Well, that's another aerial view of the tar sands region, and I don't know if you can actually see the river there. It's in there somewhere. Again, this was once boreal forest. So we traveled along here. Here's what the boreal forest used to look like. So we're coming out of the Rocky Mountains, and we're following the river, and eventually you come out of the mountains into this beautiful boreal forest, which has always been unbroken forest all the way across Canada, from one ocean to the other. And it is, for North America, as important to us as the Amazon River is to the Southern Hemisphere. The boreal forest of Canada is considered the lungs of North America, in the same way the Amazon rainforest are the lungs of the Southern Hemisphere. So this is what it used to look like. And as I say, here's what's been done to it in that industrial region where tar sands are being mined. What are tar sands? These are these sands that have old, this tar, this goopy stuff. It's not like fossil fuels because it wasn't once living organisms. It's just this tar muck stuff. And it's wrapped up in the sands. It consists somewhere between 5 to 15% of the sands are this yucky tar that's used as asphalt. It's used for roofs. It's used to asphalt and roads. So it's of that consistency. But somebody figured out a way to squeeze this stuff out of the sands and then turn it into synthetic oil, synthetic crude oil. It's an incredibly dirty industrial process, maybe one of the dirtiest ever conceived of by human beings. And for the once the technology existed to do this, and once oil prices had gone up to the point where it was affordable to do this technology, they started this process in Canada. Because up in Alberta, about a third of the province has the great misfortune of being rich in this tar. So all the big oil companies have had leases up there. The Koch brothers have been up there, ExxonMobil, Sunoco, the French giant Total, they're all in there. So that's what's going on in Alberta. And I put this photograph in in because we visited the First Nation community in Fort McKay, which was about 40 miles downriver, downwind from the Fort McMurray, from the tar sands, these processing plants that you saw there. And we visited with Selena Harp, second from the right there, who's an elder of the Dene Nation. She's in her mid-70s, and she took us up on this beautiful trail that's been part of their hunting grounds and also where they go to gather berries. This place is like rich in berries, which is one of their main foods, especially in the summertime. They do a lot of hunting up there. And we're up there in this very sacred place at the edge down below. There's this canyon and there's a little river down there. And the reason why I wanted to show this is it just looks like this lovely walkway that we all took. But because of the air pollution from the tar sands, this has become such a toxic environment that no one will eat the berries that grow there every year anymore. And she said that every time it rains in the puddles from the pools, there's this yellow, yucky stuff that the rain washes down into the soil. This is where she lives. She lives right in the Athabasca River, which is now so contaminated because of the industrial waste from the tar sands industry that they find fish that are deformed with two heads and lesions that are open and cancers. So fish used to be one of their staple sources of food, right? And the water is so bad that they can't use the water that comes out of their taps anymore. She showed me scars on her arms and hands from taking showers or trying to wash in this water, because if you wash in it, if you wash in hot water, lesions break out. People break out in rashes from this. The water is so contaminated. So they're now completely reliant on bottled water, which the companies and the tribal council, they put their money together to make sure that all these people have bottled water. So they have to bathe in bottled water. They do everything with bottled water. And there's a view just away from her house, what the air is like in their community. Now the reason I tell that story is because this is one of those areas where, because of this drive we have for oil and because most of the easy oil has been gotten out of the ground, we're doing more and more looking for what they call the unconventional oil sources. Tar sands, that's what the fracking is all about. It's trying to get at these sources of oil and gas that still exist that now, because of technology, we can get to. Because the easy stuff, where you just put a jack down in the ground and poof, all this oil pops up, those days are over. Same thing with coal. The easy coal's also been gotten. So the coal extraction also is becoming more and more damaging, destructive, because in order to get to it now, they blow up whole mountains to get to the coal seams. This is the crude oil pipeline from Canada, and I wanted to, again, we're talking about integral ecology. So up here is Fort McMurray, where the tar sands region, this is the tar sands region, and because they're kind of landlocked, right, how do you get that oil to market? How do you get that goop to market? You have to get to ports. And the only way to get to ports is by way of pipelines or railroad. So here, there's this immense pipeline network. This one I don't think will ever be built because of the opposition of the First Nation peoples that I was talking about this morning. There's another one that's being talked about of going through Canada, but that too is meeting a lot of opposition. So that has also not yet been built. And there is the oil pipelines for TransCanada, the Keystone. Most of it exists. It was only the XL portion that was this portion right here that was controversial and not built. But in fact, TransCanada has an oil pipeline that goes from here down to here. Okay? And all of this is to get oil down to the Gulf of Mexico, to the ports, to the refineries in the south. And then we here in the upper Midwest, look at lucky us. We have pipelines. We are integrated right into the heart of this pipeline network. Right? It comes across Minnesota. This is not TransCanada. This is a company called Enbridge. And Enbridge has big plans for expanding their pipeline network through our part of the world. Precisely because TransCanada lost theirs, now they're really seeing an opportunity to become a major way to get from here and also from Bakken in North Dakota. Through these pipelines, and these already exist. There's already tar sands goop. It's not yet oil until it goes to the refineries, but this goop, it's already coming through these pipelines. This one goes right under the Straits of Mackinac. It's a 60-year-old pipeline. Concerns a lot of people. Because that pipeline, some people went down and took some images of it, some video, and found it's not in great condition. So we try not to think too much about what it would mean to have an oil pipeline breach under the Straits of Mackinac and the pollution that would come to both Lake Huron and Lake Michigan. And then we have this pipeline that comes right across Wisconsin, down around Chicago, and to the refinery, the BP refinery in Whiting, Indiana, which is expanding like crazy to refine more of this tar sands oil. And then this is to get all the stuff to market down to these ports. So integral ecology, everything is connected. This is the BP refinery in Whiting, and this photograph hardly does justice. I mean, I took 1 million of these, and I wish we could do a whole room where I could put them all together so you could get a sense of just how enormous this place is. And it's part of that whole toxic environment around Gary and East Hammond and East Chicago. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with some of that region and know just how bad it is from the old days of the steel mills and all of that, chemical companies. It's just one big poison part of the world sitting right on Lake Michigan. And BP, this is again, wandering around, it's a friend, a colleague down there who leads what he calls toxic tours. If any of you are ever interested and want to take one of his tours, I'm telling you, it's eye-opening. I went down alone with him. We just spent a day wandering around because he knows the place really well. This is a place we stopped because this is an oil leak just outside the main part of the BP plant. This has been going on for over a year, more than 1 million gallons already leaked, and it's still leaking. And nobody seems to know how to stop it. Now these things are going on all over the place. You'd think they'd be big news, but they're not. And this is a little community in the shadows of the BP refinery called Marktown. Marktown is considered a legacy community. It was built for housing by some of the old steel mill companies, and for a long time housed a largely African-American middle-class community of workers who worked mostly in the steel mills. And BP has decided they want this land to expand their refinery and for parking lot for their expanding industries. So little by little, they've been consuming this community. And this community has been organizing. They've been trying every way they can think of to try to hold together this community. And as you can see, they're losing little by little. So they sit right in the shadows of the BP refinery. Again, this is part of the story I'm telling about what the meaning of integral ecology. Everything is connected. Some of you who live in Michigan, I'm sure, have a very, very bad memory of the pipeline breach in the Kalamazoo River at Talmadge Creek. This happened in 2010. The Enbridge pipeline, that's part of that network that runs through Wisconsin, had a breach at Talmadge Creek that ended up spilling more than 1 million gallons of tar sands goo, this thick stuff, into the Kalamazoo River. That's the breach. Again, it was an old pipeline. These breaches happen at the weldings. And there are many reasons why we're concerned about the way Enbridge behaves as a company. But when their computers showed suddenly that there was a loss of pressure in this pipeline, they decided maybe it was because the goo was kind of sticky and getting stuck in the pipeline, so they increased the pressure. And for 17 hours, the stuff spewed out of this pipeline. Now this is going on 6 years, and it still is not completely cleaned up because cleaning up tar sands oil is very difficult to do. So now we're talking about major contamination. A lot of people living in the fumes of this became quite sick. So again, integral ecology, everything is connected. This is that pipeline I was telling you about underneath the Straits of Mackinac. It's been there again for 60 years under enormous pressure, winters, water pressure. And you can't really get Enbridge to commit to or to tell you that they've done a serious study of how well this pipeline is doing. And that's the damage. This is where they figure the oil would flow into Huron and Michigan should there be a breach. Because everything is interconnected. And then this photograph, you may have heard about the big fire in the Fort McMurray, Alberta area in May. This region of the tar sands literally erupted in flames, one of the biggest wildfires in the history of Canada, because of drought, because of global warming, being caused by this industry. There was something about this that felt like karma to me, right? When I was in Jasper National Park in the mountains in the middle of September, in 2013, the temperature the day we were there was 87 degrees, right? Record heat. Every spring, they're talking about record heat up in this area. Forests are dying because of the heat, because of drought, because of insect infestation, because of all of these factors. Again, everything's interconnected. And they had this enormous fire that actually burned about a third of the city of Fort McMurray. I mean, I feel for those people, and I don't judge them, but there was something about this that had the feeling of, yeah, this is what's coming because of how we've lived. Again, everything interconnected. And we were not immune from the impacts of those fires. Some of you who live around here may remember that in May, our skies became very smoky. I mean, there were times you could smell it and people were feeling sick, and the sky was kind of this weird color all day, and we had these orange-brown sunsets. That was the smoke from the Fort McMurray fires, from the Alberta fires. Because that's what happens, because there's an atmosphere and it's active and it blows through a jet stream, and here's where the smoke came. Look how far that smoke came across the United States, because everything's interconnected. So I wanted to share that story because it's a story about relationships between living organisms, this one, and the environment in which we are developing and what we've done to that environment. So what I would like to say, and the Pope says this very strongly, if we think we can create healthy lives in that kind of ecology, right, we have to think again. That is not a healthy environment. Life can't really thrive in an environment like that. And so this living organism has to ask itself how it's going to shift the ecology in which we live. These interconnections, these relationships. How do we go about creating a healthy environment in which life can thrive? Because it's not going to in that. So I go back to this quote about the bold cultural revolution. All of this shows the urgent need for us to move forward in a bold cultural revolution. Science and technology are not neutral. They have an impact. They impact how we live. From the beginning to the end of a process, various intentions and possibilities are in play and can take on distinct shapes. I find this paragraph remarkable the more I read it, because it's not just the technology itself, not even the possibilities, it's the intentions that are at play. So we really have to think about that. What are the intentions of this industrial world that we've created? What's behind it? What are the intentions of those companies that are doing business in the oil sands industry? Nobody is suggesting a return to the Stone Age. We're not saying everybody's got to go back to hunting and gathering, because that's not going to work either, right? But we need to slow down, look at the reality in a different way, to appropriate the positive and sustainable progress which has been made, but to recover the values and the great goals swept away by our unrestrained delusions of grandeur, because that's what those unrestrained delusions have created. Where we just keep thinking we can keep digging in the earth and burning this stuff and think that somehow we're going to keep control of this process and everything's going to be okay. It's not okay. Conditions on the planet are getting worse every day because everything's interconnected. So, okay, we need a bold cultural revolution. We talked about some of this morning, and this is, of course, the only way, but it's something I wanted to go back to because it may be familiar to a lot of you. I have found myself going back to this. Remember the Circle of Praxis? Remember See, Judge, Act? This was a very common practice back in the 70s and 80s, and especially in Latin America, and we kind of picked it up from the Latin Americans, about how you look at reality and how you see what's really going on in your reality and begin to respond to it appropriately. And they developed this process called the Circle of Praxis. And it has these wonderful steps, which are where the arrows are. And it begins with, again, looking at the reality, defining it, describing it. What is it? We just described a reality, what it is to live in a fossil fuel economy in an age of the end of the easy oil, sort of at the end of the era of fossil fuel, the fossil fuel age. And we saw what that looks like. So if you sat for a while, and you could start at almost any point of the ecology, the interconnectedness of that. You could start in Kalamazoo. You could sit there by that creek, and you could talk to the people that were there, and you could look at it from that vantage point. Or you could go talk with the people in Marktown, in the shadows of the BP refinery. Or you could start there was also a breach in Adams County in a field in 2012, same pipeline network. Or you could start by sitting up in Fort McKay with the elders of the First Nations there and talk about how their old way of life is gone forever because of this industry. You could start at almost any point, and you can start asking the question, how did this, where we are, this thing come to be? Like starting with the pipeline breach. How did it come to be? What created this? And you do a deep analysis of what created that. All the different forces at work. I remember a story from El Salvador, actually, in the base community, one of the Christian-based communities, where that village started out with, how come we don't have electricity here, and wouldn't it be good if we could bring in a couple of light bulbs, get a wire and a light bulb, and maybe we could have a refrigerator, and that would change everything. One refrigerator can change life in a village a lot once you can preserve foods, right? And so they started with a pastoral leader, a delegate of the word, this kind of process. What do we have to do to get a light bulb? And it began this whole process into why is it hard, and who has control of electricity, and who makes these decisions. And pretty soon, this was sort of a radicalizing process where people began to realize who had power in El Salvador, who was making the decisions for them that determined whether or not they were going to get a light bulb and a refrigerator in their community. And again, you can start that kind of reflection along any point in an interconnected world like this, an integrated and integral ecology, an environment where everything's interconnected, and start there and start looking at all the ways that we see these interconnections. And then from there, you do an analysis of power. Who has power? Who's making the decisions? Why is it like this? And how did this come to be? And the next one, in terms of the faith community, which is the hardest challenge of all, is after you've looked at all that, what does our gospel faith tell us to do in response to that analysis and to what we've seen? That gets really interesting. That opens up the Gospels in a whole new way, right? What do the Beatitudes and the Woes look like once you've done that kind of an analysis? What does Matthew 25 look like? How do we feed the hungry in a world like this? You know, you begin to see that we don't have injustice by accident. It's not fate. It comes about by deliberate decisions that are being made. And while that can seem overwhelming, it's actually empowering, because then you start to see where changes can be made. That's what made the liberation movements in Latin America so powerful. That's what's made a lot of the indigenous movements all over North America and South America so powerful, because indigenous communities have been doing that. The very same kind of process. Who's got the power? Where are decisions made? What's going on? And then where do we have leverage to affect those places of power? And then the fourth step is to act, to take action, to make a decision based on that understanding of the reality, the social analysis, the power analysis, the faith reflection. Now, what do we feel called to do as a community? And that can be all kinds of things, but a lot of energy can be unleashed in the process like that. So, I have to show this one more time because I can't get enough of showing this. This needs to be part of the focus of that reflection. How do we start to bring those two lines back together? How do we start to live back in the balance of the earth? We can't do it if we insist on the upscale standards of living of the Western world, and particularly this country. We can't. We are the largest consumers of almost anything you can name, certainly of energy. I know people say, no, well, China. Yeah, China uses more energy and they emit more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. But there are also 1.3 billion people. And if you do a per capita measurement, we are so far, we're like up here and China's way down here. Because on a per capita level, we're 3 times Europe, Western Europeans. We're at that scale. So if the idea is that people who are living in poverty have a right not to live in poverty, and we're all already living beyond the capacity of the planet to support us as we're living now, what does that say to those of us who live way beyond the means that we need to live in? I mean, what does that say to the affluent? If we don't downscale enough, we can't resolve most of the major issues of our world. And that's one of the things that Pope Francis is really trying to get at in this document, where he brings together in the most eloquent way the issues of both ecological justice and social justice. That there is no escaping either one. You can't do one or the other. They are part of the same dynamic. And he says it in this wonderful quote. Nature cannot be regarded as something separate from ourselves or as a mere setting in which we live. We are part of nature, included in it, and thus in constant interaction with it. Recognizing the reasons why a given area is polluted requires a study of the workings of society, its economy, its behavior patterns, and the way it grasps reality. This, by the way, is paragraph 139 if you have a book. Given the scale of change, it is no longer possible to find a specific, discrete answer for each part of the problem. It is essential to seek comprehensive solutions which consider the interactions with the natural systems themselves and with social systems. And this is the part I really wanted to highlight. We are faced not with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather with one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental. Strategies for a solution demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time protecting nature. That's a big challenge. That's a big one. Now, none of us here can do all three all at once, but all three have to be done. So then I will finish with just a few thoughts on what he says about the common good, because I think, again, just in the way in which the Bold Cultural Revolution presents an agenda for us, so does the way he delineates the principles of the common good, which I kind of pulled out of various paragraphs. The principle of the common good he calls a central and unifying principle of social ethics. And these were the four main points he made. It includes respect for the human person as such, the overall welfare of society, the principle of subsidiarity, and social peace. Now, the principle of subsidiarity, again, this has come up in Catholic social teaching for a long time. And I think probably the most succinct definition of it, which I think is, again, really important when we think about how we grab hold of this and what we can do in our communities. Subsidiarity holds that social and political issues should be dealt with at the most immediate or local level that is consistent with their resolution. Now, what the economy tends to do is have a big solution that it tries to impose over everybody. And so what subsidiarity, when you hear the church talking about subsidiarity as such an essential element of the work of social justice and ecological justice, it's that you work at the most local place where whatever problem you're dealing with can find its solution. And that's a real response. That is actually a very radical response to a global economy that's trying to create a mono-corporate culture, right? Monocropping in agriculture, Walmarts everywhere, Starbucks in Moscow, whatever it is, right? One size fits all, because that's the most efficient way to do corporate global economies. But we're finding out it's very bad at the level of human beings and nature, at the level of community and bioregions. The interconnections among environment, social structures, culture, and meaning, this is how he describes them. Many intensive forms of environmental exploitation and degradation exhaust the resources which provide local communities with their livelihood. This goes to that question you raised about the big solutions to the, how you deal with big populations and the big solutions and moving resources around for them. I think this is a great response. That intensive forms of environmental exploitation, degradation exhaust the resources which provide local communities with their livelihood and undo the social structures which for a long time shaped cultural identity and their sense of the meaning of life and community. The disappearance of a culture can be just as serious or even more serious than the disappearance of a species of plant or animal. The imposition of a dominant lifestyle linked to a single form of production can be just as harmful as the altering of ecosystems. Because you've really destroyed at the local level what gives people a sense of their identity as a culture and community. I know I've been reading some wonderful reflections from some of the evolutionary biologists and anthropologists who say that the loss of a language is as bad as the loss of a species, because every language is a different expression of culture. It's a totally unique way of being on the planet. It's a different way of seeing the reality of the world. And each time we lose one of those, we lose something really essential. And I mean, those are my words at the top, but it's pretty much what he says. Segregation is anti-ecological. It is you can't have segregation and be ecologically whole. They contradict each other, right? And in this area of the world, Milwaukee, Chicago, Detroit, this is a huge issue. We can't heal our environmental, our ecological communities where we are if we don't heal this one. It is important, again, I think he quoted this, so I won't quote it again, but it's important that everybody where they live feel like they are part of their community, that it belongs to them, and they have a vital role to play. And then his concern is not just for horizontal legal justice. It's again a very important point that Keith also mentioned, that it's not just horizontal justice. It's not just trying to make a just world now as things are. There's an intergenerational justice across time, not just space, that's essential. And the Pope had, in some of his subsequent comments following the encyclical, talks about the fact that we are killing the future generations right now. We are denying life to future generations right now. So if we care about intergenerational justice, we have to think about how we live in a way that makes possible for life to continue on the planet. And we're not doing a real good job of that right now. I'm not going to read that right now because I want to just finish here so we can talk about some other things. But it leaves us with these questions, and this is maybe something we could talk about a little bit for a while. What kind of world do we want to leave to those who come after us, right? To the children now growing up? Because boy, when I'm with my almost 7-year-old godchild, and I think about what the next 70 years of her life might be like, it keeps me sort of fiercely committed to what I'm doing. Let's just put it that way. But questions that the Pope raises: what is the purpose of our life in this world? Why are we here? What is the goal of our work and all our efforts? What need does the earth have of us? That's a really interesting question, right? Leaving an inhabitable planet to future generations is first and foremost up to us. The issue is one which dramatically affects us, for it has to do with the ultimate meaning of our earthly sojourn. To which I would add, is the community of faith prepared to lead this deeper reflection? Why are we here? What's the purpose of life in this world? What role do we have in this earth? What is the point of being here? If the faith community is not going to delve into that, who is? Right? And who better than Franciscans? I pulled this right off your website, right? Franciscan philosophy. We try to promote the equality of all people within our brotherhood, the church, and the world. Our lives reflect the beatitudes, the needs of the poor, and the demands of justice shape our ministries. And then I remind us there's the beatitudes, and there's also the woes. Don't forget those. Praise be to you, my Lord, to our sister Mother Earth, who sustains and governs us, and who produces various fruit with colored flowers and herbs. That's the world entrusted to us, right? So I'm going to stop there. And again, you might just take a moment to take a deep breath, because I know this is a lot. It's been a long day. Just take a deep breath for a moment, and then we'll have some conversation. Okay, we have about 20 minutes or so to talk to one another.
Just going back to the Athabasca River, there's another issue there, how much water it takes to clean this trapped, the tar sands, and you're dealing with the Arctic Ocean water and things like that. That's also related. Right?
Oh, I could spend a whole afternoon with my slides of what's going on with the Athabasca River. Because even before the tar sands, there's fracking going on, there's coal mining going on. I mean, there's so much water that's being taken out of the watershed for all of this fossil fuel extraction that it's really sad. Yeah.
Just one question. I have a question raised. How would I reimagine talking about communion, Eucharist, and sacraments to address this? So that the way we do church and the language we use Does it promote this?
It sure could. I mean, sometimes I think, you know, some of you may be old fans of Terre de Chardin. I mean, there's a profound mystery that I think we sometimes miss in the notion of the Eucharist. What it means that bread and wine is transubstantiated, right? The idea of God being that present in matter as food and drink, right? There's something so profound in that got a little distant in the years that I was growing up before the Vatican Council, where it was all mystery and mumbo-jumbo magic and all that stuff up there. And we lost the connection with the sense of it being real food and real drink. But as you were saying that, I was thinking about the circle of praxis, thinking, wouldn't it be interesting to sit with the host and the wine and say, where did it come from? In what factories was it produced? And where did the grain come from for the hosts that we're consuming? It would be interesting to ask that, because there's this moment in the Mass where this becomes the sacramental reality. And what is it, really? And what does it mean to say that bread and wine is holy and sacramental, and to take that out to the world, to the earth, and to the other food and the human beings and community that we share it with? Yeah, whoa. Who better to do it, carry on that kind of deeper reflection than this kind of community?
In the light of what you were talking about, what hope do you have for our coming elections and the process?
I'd say get really, really active in your local organizing. I mean, the thing that I like to remind people of, because I don't see any hope in it. If you're talking about seeing anything that approaches fundamental change, the directions are not good. The corporate money that has now infected our politics and both political parties has made it really hard to see how any real change is going to come from that system. So where does change come from? It never comes from the political parties. The political parties implement the change when they are forced to, right? When LBJ signed the civil rights legislation, it's not because he woke up one morning as a great civil rights champion. It took years of struggle to make that moment happen. And there was a point where they had no choice, and even then he knew that he was losing the support of the Southern Dixie Democrats forever, which turned out to be true. I mean, the South doesn't vote for Democrats since then. But he did it anyway because he had to. You know, why did the Vietnam War finally, why did the draft come to an end? Because one day the government woke up and said, gee, we shouldn't draft people to the military anymore. It came out of years of revolt in the streets, right? Draft resistance. Will it take something that sustained? And I think it very well might. I mean, that's why I am really encouraged by the amount of local organizing, what went on in Nebraska around the Trans-Canada Pipeline. When you see that there is beginning to be true organized resistance as well as creation of new culture, this bold cultural revolution, as people work in community to try to make the transition happen, the parties will change when we make them change. So I'm not saying don't engage the process. I mean, it's that, I know we're all tired of voting for the lesser evil. I'm tired of it, but this election in particular is really troubling, I think, for the culture. There's a lot of stuff going on, voter fraud issues, and millions of disappeared votes in California, and there's some stuff going on that's very troubling that makes you wonder if we even have, if the process is even has integrity at this point. So what do? Give up? Resign ourselves? The U.S. has gone through terrible times before. Its democracy's been threatened before, Joe McCarthy, and all those other times when there have been terrible challenges here. But it's because of what goes on when citizens decide that they don't accept the status quo. So so whatever happens in November, the thing is we have to keep working to educate communities, to raise consciousness about what's really going on, to help people become locally empowered to make changes locally, which empowers them to move to the next step and the next step. I mean, I do think it was interesting that when Bernie Sanders, I'm not making any endorsements, I'm not allowed to, but when Bernie Sanders made that plea when he gave his address, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, asking young people to get involved in politics, run for local office, local school board and all that, and he was asking people to show to go to his website and sign up saying, yes, I commit to run for office, that night over 7,000 people said, yeah, I'll do that. So, I mean, that's where it's going to come from. So I'd say, you know, participate in the process, but know that it's going to take a whole lot more than what's going on in this political year to make changes.
Well, I think you've answered my question, but it has to do with, you come in contact with a lot of things that are happening. What gives you the greatest hope?
All those people doing all those fabulous things. You know, when I started doing this work 10 years ago, there was a lot more pushback and resistance. I mean, the audiences were a lot tougher. Not necessarily in a group like this, but, you know, when you're just doing something in a parish or something. But now so many more people are aware that the crisis is real. You know, the polls show that over 60%, well over 60% of people now want the government to start addressing climate change in a real way. So, I mean, in that sense, we've won the public argument. So that change has happened is really important. And one result of that is there's a lot more going on. One of the things that for me gives me the most hope, besides just being able to be connected to all of these things and the stuff in the neighborhoods in Milwaukee that I'm in touch with, is I think this millennial generation is awesome. When I go out and talk to people in their 20s and 30s, I just am so impressed. Also, university students, I guess they're a little younger than the millennials, but they get it, and they're starting to change their lifestyles, and they're looking at cultural issues, and they're scaling down, and they don't want what their parents had. They're not buying big houses. They're not buying cars. The millennial generation is the first one since the invention of the car in which the number of cars people are buying is going down. You know how significant that is? I mean, in Milwaukee, they're finally going to start building a streetcar network because they know millennials won't move to a city that doesn't have rail and other forms of public transportation. The bubbler bikes, and I think that's the greatest name ever. For those of you from Milwaukee, you know why, what a bubbler is. But the bubbler bikes are expanding them, and they're now beginning to expand them into some of the inner city neighborhoods. And there's bikes all over the place in Milwaukee. This younger generation, they want something else. It's not just that they know they're not going to be able to have what their parents' generation had. They don't want it, which I'm so intrigued by. So yeah, I think there's a huge generational shift that's happening that actually gives me a lot.
From my experience, I think one of the greatest things in the communities where people, ordinary people, are empowered to get together and realize their power. Back in the 60s, when I was here, I was the first Hispanic parish in Racine, Wisconsin. And we had Spanish centers, black centers. There were young people who got involved and moved things. They were scared. All this was scared. What did they do? They brought programs for money driven by the government to control them. So now we got to with money and keep it in power people, not with money. Once you get money involved, it screws everything up. I feel it right now.
Sure.
Not in a very safe way. Somewhere we got to with money. Money is destroying us. Every time we get something going, we bring money. We do money. They dominate. Somehow we give it back. The people have power without money.
Well, absolutely. I mean, Citizens United, we all know that was a disaster for our democracy. I mean, if corporations and CEOs are the major donors funding your political party and you get elected to the White House, why would anybody think that you would implement policies that would undermine those donors? It's just not going to happen. That's just not the way it works. So you got to get that money in. Yeah, it corrupts the system terribly.
Just as a matter of information, what is the role that schools or universities or other places play in this whole process? Not that they have to do the work, but do they have a role to play in?
Well, they could have. I mean, I think, you know, there is an interesting thing going on in the higher education world in particular, where more and more universities, including public universities, are becoming reliant on corporate foundations and corporate donors for their programs. The Koch brothers, for example, they're starting to fund chairs in various departments in universities. Now, if that brings prestige to your university and millions of dollars, what happens to the freedom, the academic freedom in an environment like that? Comcast has made huge corporate donations to the University of Maryland. I know that because I lived there for a while, near the university for a long time. And you could feel as the University of Maryland, their main campus, wanted to become more and more of one of these A1 research campuses. Well, so more and more corporate money comes in, and my question is then what happens to academic freedom? You know, what happens when public education isn't truly public anymore? And one of the reasons that's happening is because we're now in this era where people, you know, supposedly don't want to pay taxes, although again, polls show people would be very happy to pay taxes for the right things, especially here in Wisconsin. But where you keep cutting back budgets. So when you shrink the public budgets for schools, for hospitals, for healthcare, who comes in but the private corporations? And they have a very different agenda than the public interest.
What would be your approach in a parish like you have adult education and all that sort of thing?
What would be what?
What topics or ideas would initiate the process in a parish where you have adult education?
In a parish, well, can people still hear me? It sounds like this isn't.
Your battery died.
Oh, my battery died. I was going to say, all of a sudden, I felt like I went away. Where's the thing? Let's turn it off. Right? There it is. I have my glasses on, so it's all blurry. That's very dramatic when that happens. Is it on? No. Yes? No? No.
You want to give her that microphone? And
Yes.
Okay, musical microphones. Parishes. I mean, Laudato Si is the entry, I think. I mean, the thing is that when I speak in parishes, it's usually because there's some little group, you know, some little committee or some group that really gets the stuff and wants to move the parish forward. And they were thrilled when this tool came along, because now they can come in with a clout and authority of the Pope. Now, I mean, it's interesting because when even the Pope says, but your lifestyle, and people go, well, maybe now we don't agree with the Pope, right? So that's what happens. But still, it's there. And I've spoken in parishes where there's still pushback, but people really are paying attention, they're listening. It's not going to happen all at once, but if you can get some small group of people that's really committed to it and is willing over a period of time to do programs. And some of it I can remember, there was a wonderful group in Northern Virginia back when I was living in D.C. You know, everybody was doing these delegations down in Central America when I was doing that work. And they said, well, maybe we should bring delegations to the suburbs of Northern Virginia so people could see the underside of what's going on in Northern Virginia. So they started doing delegation visits to soup kitchens, to shelters and all this stuff. And it was amazing what happened to people to realize it was right there. You didn't have to go to Central America to see it. And a lot of those people were parish people. There were people who went back to their churches and got some conversation going. So parishes won't change overnight, but a small, dedicated group of people can do a lot over time by coming up with really interesting, innovative things to get people involved. Thank you.
Thank you.
What else?
Was there anything?
Wait, we need a microphone.
Corner. This is the second time in a month I've heard about the inflow of money and into America's crown jewel, our academic research institutions, and what is their fate? I heard Mark Gopin, he's a peace activist, say there's a lot of dishonest research going on in academia right now. So I'm deeply challenged by what she said and real disturbed by it. I guess my question is, our province is working on something called the human thread, clothing with a conscience. And at the foundation of the movement, it was decided not to talk about boycotts because boycotts are not relational and they are oppositional and they're divisive. But if the Koch brothers are funding, the Mississippification of Wisconsin and also academic chairs, what would a consumer do to defund these activities? I can tell you that I drive down the street and I say, can't buy from Shell, I know what they're doing in Nigeria. Can't buy from Exxon, they still haven't settled all the claims. Can't buy from BP, that's also all ongoing. So what do you think about the actions of defunding? Is that useful? What's a consumer's first move?
Yeah, I mean, the thing with boycotts is that they can be useful for one's moral conscience. I mean, it certainly makes me feel better not to buy from really, truly evil companies. I'll have nothing to do with Monsanto. Roundup Ready should be illegal. It should be not sold anywhere in the world for what it's doing to agriculture and to ecosystems all around the planet. So I don't want to participate in that. Then there's the kind of boycott where it's an educational thing, where in a community people learn together about some of these products and make decisions about what not to buy. The next step is advocacy. Doesn't mean a thing to these companies unless you tell them why you're doing it, if there isn't some communication. I mean, look at like some of the Walmart campaigns. Yeah, people were boycotting Walmart for a while over their treatment of employees. But Walmart's culture shifted when people were protesting out in front of their stores. And the living wage campaign's just been amazing in the impact that it had on Walmart. Still wouldn't shop there, but I mean, you can see how there begin to be. So it's sort of these stages. The trouble with boycotts is they can be frustrating because they don't seem to have. You can decide not to buy something, but in a global economy, what does that mean? I think some of the work around these divestment campaigns, which 350.org and Bill McKibben have been doing. Again, it's not that at this point they're having an impact on the corporation bottom line, but they sure are raising awareness because it's been getting a lot of press. Universities are getting active on this stuff. California looked at their public sector retirement fund portfolio and are moving towards divestment. When you start getting to big institutions like that, then it's kind of like the apartheid thing. I'm not sure that the divestment from companies engaged in apartheid were ever affected in their bottom line, but boy, were they affected in their public relations. And ultimately, the campaign was very successful. So the thing about boycotts at the level where you want to make real structural change is they're very labor intensive and take protracted amounts of time and large numbers of people to be effective at changing structures. But at changing consciousness, they can be very effective.
When the Pope was here, he spoke both to the Congress and to the UN. That was just before the document came out. Was there anybody or any group of the Congress or of the UN that responded to the Pope's thoughts?
Some of them applauded. No, I mean, no, there wasn't a huge impact. I mean, there are certain individuals, some of those old Catholics like Joe Biden was, he cries a lot, so.
The speaker resigned.
Are there any who are up to running for
Yeah.
election?
Yeah, John Boehner, there were more things involved than that. I mean, he was done. He was so sick of the Republicans in the House, and the Pope gave him a moment where he could do that and make a big public moral statement, which I got to give him a lot of credit for. That was a very powerful thing to do. But I don't know how much impact the Pope has when you think of the interests involved in Congress. But it doesn't mean that it wasn't important for him to be there, because that was a huge public platform. And it doesn't mean that there aren't still individuals. There are some good old Catholics there, Nancy Pelosi and others, who do take that stuff seriously, who take their Catholic social teaching seriously. But they're up against, the odds are huge. But they're not really having a conversation at that level inside Congress. You don't see that come up a whole lot. And there were some members of Congress that just didn't show up, had no intention of being in the room. So.
Do you have any examples of religious communities that have developed the cultural change that you're kind of talking about? I mean, for example, we hear about the IHM sisters in Monroe, with the way that they redid their building, but I'm talking about something on a larger scale, and particularly among men's communities, because my experience tells me that the women's communities are like they are in many things. They're ahead of us in how they're dealing with this. Do you have any examples?
Yeah, I mean, by decades, like I say, the religious women have been at this for a really long time, and part of what's very poignant for me is that this incredibly prophetic and pioneering work they've been doing for the last few decades is also coming as a lot of them are facing the end of their corporate existence and really struggling to figure out how they pass on these new ways of life, these new cultures in forming in a different way or coming up with a different kind of identity. Forming 501c3s, that kind of thing. So it's a very poignant thing. Yeah, I mean the Cincinnati Dominicans are going through a process right now. The Humility of Mary sisters, I worked with them a little bit a year or so ago in Western Pennsylvania. That was a really interesting thing because as they were coming to the 150th anniversary of the land on which the Villa Maria, the land that they had been on since coming to that part of the world, just as they were going to celebrate and do this whole rethinking about who they are and their mission and all of this stuff, the fracking companies came to town. And because they're in Western Pennsylvania, which is just loaded with gas and oil resources underground. And so they found themselves in the middle of a huge, huge conflict. Because all around Villa Maria, the people are pretty poor. And so, the company was coming along, knocking on doors, offering people a lot of money for drilling rights, and really pressuring the nuns to let them onto their property. And they went through their own discernment, and their thing was, ain't no way. But, then the question was, how much can we control what happens outside our boundaries? That first photo in my very first presentation of that fracking well, that's right on the boundary line of Villa Maria. I mean, I took that from this cornfield at the fence that there's property line. So they wouldn't allow fracking on their property, but there it was right there. So they've been both bearing witness about that, suffering the consequences of it, while at the same time they're rethinking the organic farm they're doing and their mission and all of that stuff. So I think there's a lot of that going on. Some nuns have been divesting, corporate responsibility people are doing stockholder resolutions around this stuff. So yeah, there's a lot of that. In the men's communities, I'd love to tell you I know a lot of stuff, but I don't. I mean, I know the Oblates have a place in Illinois where they're doing education and spirituality work. Really good guys. So there is some of that, but I'd like to explore. Actually, that's a good question to explore more. Got to get a microphone too. Over here.
I'll holler now.
No. It's so that the people online can hear. Okay, wrap up. Last question. Make it good.
It ran right out of my head. Right out of my head. The dialogue thing. People are not used to dialogue, sure. They're used to winning an argument.
Yes.
And that's normal American, they're all right. Is there an approach or a way of going at that helps people to see that without that you're really in big trouble? If you aren't going to do any attentive listening, then you'll never catch on to understanding. Is any of that, there are programs for that?
Yeah, there have been people who have really been working on this. How do you have a dialogue? And there are resources for it, but one of the most basic things is that you set up rules before a conversation begins. You set up rules, rules for the dialogue. And they include things like every person gets to speak, and while they're speaking, nobody interrupts, everybody listens. And then you don't respond to them, right? So there's no arguing, you just listen to their point of view. Then there's quiet, there's a moment of pause, and then someone else gets to speak, and everyone has to listen. It's an incredibly intense discipline, but where this happens, it is amazing to see how it could shift dynamic in a group. I mean, Buddhists have been practicing this, and Sangha. I mean, some of this is older. The talking stone is another way, where the one with the talking stone gets to speak. The rules are also that you can't talk on forever. I can't give you a half-hour lecture, and everybody's got to sit there and listen. So there are rules set up, with the idea being Don't think ahead of time of how you're going to respond to these words over here. You just sit and you listen and you receive. Sometimes people have these dialogues where they talk to each other, and after one person speaks, the person they talk to tells them what they think they said. And that's very interesting, because sometimes you hear they didn't hear it accurately, or the person corrects themselves. So, yeah, there are a lot of really interesting dialogue processes that you could probably find that would help.
She talked about that so often.
Yeah, very important. Well, thank you all. We need to stop.
Just a quick reminder, brothers, that tonight at 7